US-backed anti-government protesters here in Thailand like to bring up the 2010 protests and the violence in particular that took place here in Bangkok 10 years ago. And they like to do this to accuse the Thai military of being brutal murderers. According to them, and the Western media who likes to repeat these claims, the Thai military killed over 90 peaceful protesters just for asking for democracy. Yet this is completely untrue, and explaining what actually happened in 2010 is really important, especially if we want to make sure something like that never happens again. First, the protests had nothing to do with democracy. The protesters, followers of billionaire ex-prime minister and fugitive Thaksin Shinawatra, were mobilized after Thai courts seized $1.4 billion of Thaksin's personal assets. So the protests were part personal vendetta, part desperate power grab, but also part backed by foreign interests, eager to get Thaksin Shinawatra back into power. And they used ordinary people as essentially cannon fodder to do so. The protests started in March 2010, but the violence began on April 10th. The Thai military was dispersing crowds by firing blanks in the air and using riot troops armed with shields and batons to move protesters off the streets. Now, they did something like this the year before, and during that operation, no one died. Now, what happened next is admitted to even by the pro-opposition fake rights front, Human Rights Watch. Now, forget about the fact that today, when Human Rights Watch talks about the 2010 violence, they contradict their own report. But in their report, Descent into Chaos, published in 2011, they admit who really started the violence. Now, this is sort of a long quote, but please bear with me. As night fell, renewed clashes erupted when the army attempted to move in on the Pan Pha camp and were confronted by well-armed and organized groups of armed militants affiliated with the UDD. Known as the Black Shirts, they fired M16 and AK-47 assault rifles at soldiers and used M79 grenade launchers and M67 hand grenades at the Kok Wua Junction and at the Democracy Monument, devastating army troops in the process. The Army unit's commanding officer, Colonel Ramklau, was among the first to be killed, apparently in a targeted M79 grenade attack. Many senior officers were wounded. Panicked and leaderless, the troops withdrew into back streets, often firing directly at UDD protesters massed before them. The result was Bangkok's deadliest violence in decades, which left 26 people dead, including 5 soldiers, and more than 860 wounded. Now, that same night, a Japanese Reuters journalist was killed, and just like Reuters likes to do, it commissioned a completely biased and politically motivated inquest that concluded it was the army who killed them. The only evidence they cited was that the bullet wounds came from 5.56 millimeter rounds, which the inquest concluded could only have come from the military side because only the military had M16s and Tavers firing that kind of round. But look at this picture right here, taken that same night. Look at that rifle right there. That's an M16, which chambers 5.56 millimeter rounds, just like the military's rifles. And even Human Rights Watch, in their own report, admits the militants had M16s. So right there is an example of how the Western media, and Reuters in particular, have tried to twist the facts around the 2010 violence and place the blame on the army, when even Human Rights Watch itself admits in its report that it was the protesters and the heavily armed Black Shirts who drew first blood. Now, the Human Rights Watch report and many articles across the Western media even admitted that there were between 300 to 500 of these armed militants. The opposition's own international spokesman, Sean Boonprakon, admitted there were armed militants working with the opposition, and this rogue army general, Sadang, was not only openly leading these militants, but was openly working for Thaksin Shinawatra. And from April 10th to May 19th, because of this army of opposition militants in the streets of Bangkok, there were gun battles between them and Thai soldiers, and that's where you get this number of 91 dead. That number includes soldiers, police, bystanders, journalists, and counter-protesters, all killed in the crossfire. It wasn't an army crackdown on unarmed, peaceful protesters, but raging gun battles, arson, and terrorism initiated and carried out by the opposition. It was the Royal Thai Army who eventually stopped it and restored peace and order to the city. So this myth of Thailand's military killing innocent protesters is just that. It's a myth. It's one retold by the protesters for obvious political reasons. But why does the Western media repeat these lies? The Western media tells these lies because, just like in Syria, Libya, Ukraine, and even more recently in Hong Kong, the Western media is supporting these opposition groups and protecting their image. They're covering up their violence, and they're portraying the government's response to that violence as brutal repression. It's propaganda. It's turning aggressors into victims and making the victims look like the aggressors. And we see the Western media doing that again in Thailand today regarding the protests right now. They're helping the mobs retell these old lies about 2010, but they're also helping cover up the violence and vandalism the protesters today carry out every time they come into the streets. The answer, as always, is creating and supporting alternative media. So Thailand has a voice to tell its side of the story and add some balance to this mountain of lies the Western media continues to build against Thailand and nations like Thailand. Please check the video description for all the references and evidence. There are also ways in the video description for you to help support my work, like a link to my Patreon account, where you can not only help by donating once a month, but you also get content and other benefits in return. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share it. If you subscribe to the channel, that helps the channel grow, and I really do appreciate that a lot. And as always, thank you very much for watching.